I left at 10 and you were gone. So I don't know what you did in the 3 blocks between where I was and where you went. Oh, my. And I thought I'm a stick in the mud when it gets after 9. Were you sore?
I wasn't. I didn't get that.
They got some good pictures, and it was anyway. We're in Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8. We'll have Aaron check here in a minute. Or Aaron, is there? Okay. We're about done with this one. 9, I'm not probably going to do a handout for, because it's a transition to the next period. In the next period, we're going to use that, the lists, and make notes that way. And so, we look at that. I marked that we were to start in verse 4, but that was not the right mark. And so, I believe that we were in section 12 through 21. Does anybody have a marker memory?
I was thinking we were ready for 22 through 31.
Okay, that would be about right. I had trouble remembering. Did we read James 5:15 through 17? If not, let's start there. You know, we had VBS and Bible camp, and so we're a long ways from where we've had a lot of Bible study and a lot of different topics between now and back then. So in James 5:15 through 17 here, it says the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up, and if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Confess your faults one to another, and pray for one another, that you may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And then it tells us about Elijah, who was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it did not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And then really we probably put verse 18 with this, because it tells us that he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. Now, if you go back and you look at verse 14, and sometimes hard to know how many verses to tie together for your notes, but it says, is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him. And so what we were looking at here as we finished up, or we're looking at Proverbs 8:12 through 21, was the idea that good rulers rule using what? Wisdom, which will give them righteous judgment. That's what wisdom is, righteous judgment. And we see this, so the example that James has is that the elders, they pray, and there are individuals that should possess wisdom, right? As rulers over a congregation. So we think of that in a smaller sense. So we go back to Proverbs 8 and verse 22. That's where we'll begin. It says, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. Before his works of old, I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When there was no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no foundations abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth or the fields or the primal dust of the world, when he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, when I was beside him as a minister or a master craftsman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men. We go back and we look at this, and what I have here was in the beginning was wisdom, and then I have in parentheses, and before, right? Or before creation, wisdom already was. Okay? Why is that? Why would the wisdom already be there? We go back, a key verse that we've used for the study is James 1 verse 5. If any of you lack wisdom, what do? Ask who? God. God's eternal. Who's the possessor of wisdom? God is, right? Who's the one that blesses us, bestows us with wisdom? God does. And so wisdom is eternal, right? And so with that in mind, I want us to go real quick to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And we looked at this as we introduced the study here. But here Paul, and here he's writing to the Corinthian brethren, and he's talking about the difference between two types of wisdom. The world's wisdom, which is man's wisdom, and God's wisdom. And so this applies here, and then as we go through the next couple sections, I think that 1 Corinthians 1 ties closely. And so when you come to verse 18, so in 1 Corinthians 1:18, it says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing." Who are those who are perishing?
Those that are lost.
Yep, those that are lost, right? The world. Those who are perishing. And so we see here that the message of the cross is foolishness to who? To the world. Okay? So think about that. And I think over and over again, and maybe I've overemphasized it, but I'm going to mention it again. We talk about wisdom, righteousness. They go hand in hand. Godliness and wisdom, they go hand in hand. Okay? How do we become godly today? By obedience to the gospel, right? Through obedience to the gospel. And so when Paul is giving this instruction to the brethren here, and it's a warning, right, about the world's wisdom, so he tells them here that the preaching or the message of the cross is foolish to those who are lost, but to us, which are who? You go back to verse 2, the church, which the church are the saved. It says, "But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And you think about how it's translated, those who are being saved. Okay? You think about that. Were they already saved? Paul tells us that he presses towards the mark, doesn't he? And so it's something that we have to continue our constant walk. For Christ's blood, 1 John 1 verse 7, to continue to cleanse us. Okay? So you think about who are being saved. It is the power of God. Paul wrote in Romans 1 verse 15 that he said, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto" what? Salvation. Right? What was that? The wisdom of God. Okay? The message of the cross. Because in verse 19 we see, "For it is wisdom, or it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent." We have examples in the Bible of men who were in the world's eyes on such a high pedestal, but they were humble. Name some of those individuals that might come to mind that had a humbling experience. That's the first one that comes to my mind when I think about it. I also think about Pharaoh. The difference between the two men or the two rulers was what they did, right? When God chastened them, one's heart was hardened, one's heart became tender, right? You see that, okay? So those are great examples. So he said, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise." What are we talking about? Worldly wisdom. How long does God's wisdom last? Forever. It's already there, okay? It's already been here, it's already here, and it will always be here. So then, you come to verse 20, he says, where is the wise, where is the scribe, where is the disputer of the age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Right? These are questions Paul's asking. Has God made things of the world foolish? We're not studying the book of Ecclesiastes, but we've mentioned some passages from Ecclesiastes through this study because we have the same author as Proverbs, right? How does Solomon begin the book of Proverbs? What's the word that we see pop up? Ecclesiastes 1. Vanity. What's the word vanity mean? Emptiness. Right? Emptiness. And there you have book of Ecclesiastes, another book of wisdom. And so here he tells us, again, the contrast between the two. Verse 21, for since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. Now you think about that. The foolishness of the message. And again, we're jumping from one side of the room to the other, right? Because we're looking at world's wisdom and God's wisdom. And so here Paul's giving two perspectives, right? From a Christian's perspective, the message of the cross is what? A great thing, a wonderful thing, a blessing. From the world's perspective, what is it? It's ridiculous, right? We talk about Naaman, right? Naaman. Why was it that God required Naaman to dip 7 times in the Jordan River to be cleansed of leprosy? He wanted obedience. And Tara's right. We ask the question, why 7? Why not 6? Why not 8? We don't know. But that's what God said, right? And what came through that obedience? He's clean. He was cleansed, right? And same thing when we study the plan of salvation and things. Why did God choose the cross? Because he did. Okay, there's lots of things, right? It may not make sense to us, and sometimes we sit down and we study, and probably all of us hopefully have experienced this. We study with somebody, and they say, I don't understand why these details are so important to God. But what do we know God as? A God of details. And so it's not me, if I was Naaman, I probably would have went, why in the world 7 times in the Jordan? And even Naaman in that example, he asked the question, he said, what about other rivers that are cleaner?
Is it sometimes our humanness to ask questions and be kind of we're troublesome. We're like, why? Why?
Yeah.
We're always that, we'll just obey,
Yeah. Parents sometimes say to the children, when the children say, why do I have to? What does the parent say? Because I said so. Okay. And so does it always make sense? Now we see fulfillment of prophecy. There's a lot of things we talk about Christ on a cross in the right time, the right place. We understand a lot of that. But still, again, why was that God's plan? Because of God's perfect plan. He has wisdom that we don't comprehend. Maybe one day in eternity, we will continue. I think there's a lot more dots maybe we'll connect. But again, we're looking at man's wisdom versus God's wisdom. And I think this is a principle when we look at these wisdom writings, we think about righteousness is it's not for us to argue, say, why did God require that? Why does God require baptism? That's what he required, right? It's not for me to argue. I just know what he's instructed us to do, right? So we come back and we look at 1 Corinthians 1. And he tells us this in verse 22, for the Jews request a sign and the Greeks seek after wisdom. So you have two different types of people. You have God's children, his people. Of course, 1 Corinthians is written at a time when the old law is no longer in effect. And so what are the Jews searching for? Some kind of sign. Some kind of sign. And for us, studying it and looking back 2,000 years, we say, how could they miss it? Right? But they were still searching. And again, the Greeks were searching for what type of wisdom. God's wisdom is wisdom, but it's not worldly wisdom. And you have a worldly mindset that's searching for what? Worldly wisdom. Right? Okay. So you go on. He said, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, to the Greeks foolishness. And so I think this is similar, at least in my mind, to what Joshua said in Joshua 24, when he says, he's told, and this is paraphrased, but he said, at the end he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But in the verse and a half before that statement, he says, you can serve this God, you can serve that God, or you serve the right God, but I'm going to serve who? The right God. And so when you look at this, but we preach Christ. Paul says the Jews are looking for something, the Greeks are looking for something, but they're looking for the wrong thing. And he said, what are we looking for? We're looking for Christ. And so he says here that we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews as a stumbling block, to the Greeks as foolishness. Right? Have you ever went to some sort of a training and they ask you, have you ever done this before? And you say, oh yeah, I've done it lots of times. They say, oh no, you probably got a bunch of bad habits we're going to have to unteach, right? The same thing with religion. There's so many ideas based upon our culture and our background that causes us to miss the wisdom of God, to miss the gospel. And that was the same is true as the first century. They were looking for something that wasn't there. And we're trying to compare this back to that we need to be seeking true wisdom. Right? And I get confused by worldly wisdom sometimes. We all do, don't we? We say, this has to be it. It's really not. Okay? So then, he goes on verse 23. He says, a stumbling block to the Jews, to the Greeks it's foolish, but to those who are called, we're in verse 24, but those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the what? Wisdom of God. You think about that. Christ is the power of God, the wisdom of God. Do I have to understand why God chose Christ during the first century to die on a cross? I know you've studied it a lot. I've studied it a lot. We study, we say, we understand what happened. But sometimes we still ask why. Because it was God's wisdom. He knew what was right. So, he tells in verse 25, here you have the conclusion, really, of these statements. He says, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. We go back to the illustration. We talk about our children. We say, because we said so. Right? And a lot of times when we become adults and we are mature and our wisdom has increased, we understand why our parents were instructing us to do even though we didn't understand. Same's true for God. We have to, by faith, right? You go to Hebrews chapter 11. Because of Abraham's faith, what did he do? He wandered in a foreign land. Did he know where he was going or what he was doing? God would give him promises along the way, right? And so, kind of breadcrumbs along the way. But because of faith, right? And so when we teach the gospel plan of salvation, which is where we're looking at this, is the wisdom of God. Solomon's instructing his son to seek wisdom. If he was, and at that time, the wisdom of God was Judaism. But if he lived today or during the first century, or any time in between, that he would have been urging his son to seek wisdom, which would have been what? The gospel. Okay? And so we go back. Any questions or comments about that? I think it ties closely to what we're studying, what we've looked at here. So we go back to verse 22. We read this. I think this section of Scripture makes a lot of sense. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way before his works of old. What did God always have? Wisdom. He's never been without it. We develop wisdom. We need to pray for wisdom. We need to do things to try to promote our wisdom. But God's had it. It's just there. Okay? Verse 23, he says, I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When we think about Philippians 1 and verse 4, if somebody wants to turn there and read that so we can refresh our minds with that verse. But we understand that Christ was planned, the church was planned, when? Before the foundation of the world. Okay, somebody there, do they want to read that? Sorry, Ephesians 1:4. Sorry.
According as he hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love.
He chose who? The church. The church to be saved. Okay? This isn't predestination. He chose the church. That's the wisdom of God. When? Before the foundation of the world. What we just looked at in 1 Corinthians was what? The gospel is the wisdom of God. Okay? It's the wisdom of God revealed. And so this is something that God had because of his wisdom. When did God it pop in his mind that he should have the church? I don't know. You know, he lives in an eternal realm. We cannot comprehend time. Okay? But God planned it. He purposed it. Those sorts of things. Then when you get to verse 24, he says, when there was no depths, I was brought forth. And you go back in the end of verse 23, it says, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth, is how the New King James reads. What is the most unexplored part of our earth? The ocean. Most of the water in the ocean we cannot get to, if I understand things properly, about the amount of water that's so deep. And God knows all about those things. And he said before that was even there, what was there? Wisdom. Okay? He says, when there is no fountains abounding from the earth, before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before all these things. You know, we look at the world and we see things as they are. Right? As they are. But has the earth always looked this way? No, it's always been this way. And one time we were in Colorado and we were camping. It was kind of a guy's trip. And there was this mountain, and we were in the mountains, of course. And I said, hey, let's go up there. There's a couple of us. We said, let's go up there. And you think, probably nobody's ever been up here, you know. And it was quite a climb. It wasn't a climb, but, you know, a hike and everything. And we get up there, and there's Pepsi cans and a campfire. And we're going up there like we're Lewis and Clark, like nobody's ever been here before. We're going to explore it. There's Pepsi cans up there, right? And so our minds, right? The gravity. God says before anything was, before that mountain with the Pepsi cans was there, and before the Pepsi cans were there, God had it figured out. Okay, his wisdom. So then he tells us here in verse 26, while as yet he had not made the earth or the fields or the primal dust of the world, when he prepared the heavens, where was wisdom? Already there. Already there. Already established. Already mature. Already active. He said when he drew the circle on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit. You watch the news, you watch different scientific programs, and what are we scared of happening? The ocean rising and flooding the entire earth. Who set the limits for the ocean? God did. Right. God said it. Okay. If he wants it to flood the earth, will it? We have examples of that. Genesis 6 and 7. Read that. But it won't. That's right. Because of the promise that God made. Okay. So we see in verse 29, so that the waters would not transgress his command. We think about this. We have laws of nature. Names the laws of nature. Probably the one we're most familiar with is the law of gravity. What's the law of gravity? It will fall. What goes up must come down. We're held to the earth, right? We have weights, all these things. And we say that's a law of Mother Nature. You know where that idea of the law of Mother Nature came from? Trying to scoop God out of the picture. Okay? So God says that the ocean stays where it's at because they cannot do what? Transgress God's command. The laws of nature that we have are because of the wisdom of God and because of the authority of God. Okay? When we read Genesis 1 and 2, and we see all the things that were happening, and one of the things that we see a theme of is after its kind. Is that still true today? Absolutely. Nothing's changed. Why? Because it's a law of Mother Nature? No. It's a law of God. We don't need to scoot God out of the way, right? It's a law of God. It's a scientific law. But he says before all these things existed, which is all we know as human beings, is the physical, wisdom was already there. Okay?
We just named it something different, and gave it its
Yeah, so,
arbitrary.
hey, look what we discovered.
Hey, we know it, gravity, it's not gravity, it's just whatever gate it's on.
Yeah, we called it something. Yeah, that's a good point. When he assigned the sea its limits so that the waters would not transgress his command, when he marked out the fountains of the earth. Yeah, you're right. Sorry, foundations of the earth. Then I was beside him as a master craftsman. Who was beside him? Wisdom. Was with who? God. Working hand in hand, right? As partners. Think about that. Do we have any partnerships on this earth? What's the first partnership we read about?
I got written beside mine as a parent and a child.
A parent and a
Because,
child?
God has the wisdom and then,
Yeah. So we see these things hand in hand. You don't see God without wisdom. You don't see wisdom without God. Right? If there was no God, would there be any wisdom? Go ahead.
When I read this, I think of the fact that, as you stated, the first part of this, wisdom comes from God.
Mm-hmm.
This is saying, as wisdom is saying here, wisdom is an attribute of God.
Yes.
And when you read all of this, God had to have the wisdom to know how to make the limits of the sea,
Mm-hmm.
the gravity, all of these things. It just shows us that He had true wisdom, because wisdom is knowledge
Yeah.
applied.
Yeah.
Knowledge is knowing what the limit is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not someone separate from deity, but as Eric
So
pointed out,
yeah, it's
that's a good way to explain.
And so the writer Solomon's showing us, it's like we want true wisdom that knows right and wrong. It's from God.
Nowhere else. Good point. Think of all the culture of the world today who have somebody that they attribute as the holding or possessing the keys of life, right? Lots of cultures have that individual they hold up on a pedestal. But we hold up God, who, as Eric says, it's right, is one of the attributes of his character, okay, of who God is. So, verse 30, when I was beside him as a master craftsman, I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men. Everything that we have created around us was because of what? Wisdom of God. You know? And so we see that. You ever heard of the circle of life? I know we have. What's the circle of life? Circle of life is that there is not going to be so many flies that they will destroy the earth, right? Yeah. In fact, This is a fact that I learned one time. I think about, and Eric may not appreciate this as much because he doesn't like spiders, but the statistic was they believed that if it weren't for spiders eating flies, that in 30 days they would consume all the vegetation on the earth. So anyway, Eric's like, he still don't like spiders. But you think about that. But what do we see here? The balance of God. Wisdom. I don't appreciate flies. Eric doesn't appreciate spiders. But I guess we got to have them both, right? They work together.
What about ticks?
Ticks. Well, I'd like to say the verdict's still out on that, but we understand God put him here for some reason, and so he's got the wisdom.
God put it for a reason, and I can never get, I justified almost everything with ticks.
They came at the same time as a thorn and thistles.
Okay.
Well, I joke about, Noah on the ark, he had two.
2 ticks?
Well, he had two. I mean,
Just saying, that's like, it might have been on him.
yeah. But he had two, and I'm just like, he could just, I do not like mice. I say he could just, oops, Anyway, that's our point. But anyway.
That might have been a disagreement, probably.
Yeah.
We can all have oops there.
We joke, we don't want to think about biblical things in a flippant way. But we joke about, Noah was a man, right? And we always, Eric, we joke about his spiders, but all of us have some critter that we would have said, God, I don't know if I have room for that thing on my ark, right? But he obeyed because God said this is what we need, because he set all these laws in motion. All right. Let's look at verses 32. And here, it's not on your outline, pencil it in underneath. This is a short section here. I had... No, it's the next one I had the most trouble. Of course, you guys, these are your notes, so study them, and so what's important to you. But I put God, you are my children by wisdom. And just like Eric mentioned, that wisdom is one of God's attributes. We, as his children, and again, as we started, I think I've emphasized this, I always thought that, hey, if we want wisdom, we should ask God for wisdom. But God commands us that if we don't have it, to obtain it. And so when I read this section of Scripture, I think it drives that home to me in my mind. God says, you are my children by wisdom. If we don't have wisdom, we will never be a child of God. We cannot be a child of God. And that's why I almost waited until now to look at 1 Corinthians 1. Because we see that Christ, through the gospel, Christ is revealed. That is the wisdom of God. And if we don't have wisdom, we cannot be a child of God. He won't claim us because we are his children by wisdom. Let's read this section of Scriptures. Now, therefore, listen to me, children, or my children. It's italicized. For blessed are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not disdain it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the posts of my doors. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who sins against me wrongs his own soul. All those who hate me love what? Death. So we go back and we look at verse 32. Now therefore, listen to me, my who? Children. And as we mentioned, as we introduced this, the idea of an attribute of God's children is they have to possess wisdom. Okay? How many of us have wisdom overflowing? It's a continual development as Christians. We continue to develop our wisdom, to grow in that. But to become his children, we have to obey what? Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. What is that according to 1 Corinthians? The gospel, which is what? The wisdom of God. Okay. We have to be wise enough to not look at the world's wisdom, but humble ourselves and submit ourselves to the gospel, which is the wisdom of God. Then we can become one of his children. He said, for blessed are those who do what? Yeah, keep my ways. We have a song that has God bless who? God bless America. Isn't that a great thing? But I know we looked at this verse as we introduced. Proverbs 14:34 tells us that righteousness exalts what? A nation. Here in this verse, we're not talking about a nation. We're talking about individuals. But a nation's made up of individuals, isn't it? And what do we see from this verse? He said, blessed are those who do what?
Wisdom.
Keep my ways. Blessed are those who keep my ways. Okay? They keep wisdom. Does the rain fall on the just and the unjust? Yeah. They do. But special blessings go to who? The righteous, which are possessors of wisdom. He says, hear instruction and be wise, and do not disdain it. We think about that. I think it was Noah Olson at Bible camp. He said, you have 2 ears, 1 mouth. Right? We've heard that 100 times, 1,000 times. He said that. And so you think about that. You say, hear instruction and be wise, and do not disdain it. Don't push it away. What do people do? Push God's wisdom away. We don't want to hear God's wisdom. We'll find a better way. But there's not a better way. Blessed is the man who does what? Yeah, listens to me. Right? Blessed is the man that listens to me. He said, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the posts of my door. What are they doing?
Eager to gain wisdom.
Eager to gain wisdom. They're there as a student. Right? That's the idea. He said, for whoever finds me finds what? Now, that's why we read 1 Corinthians 1 tonight. Because where does life come? We could read 1 Corinthians 15. We talk about that the resurrection, the blessing that is associated with the resurrection, right? But we find life through what? The gospel. That's where life, that's the only place we can find. Do we have our physical lives? Yeah. We have our physical lives. But to have what? In 1 Corinthians 15, then here, as Paul writes that, he talks about death came through one man. Which man was that? Adam. Yes. Yeah. Don't get mixed up, no. Where's life come through? 1 Corinthians 15. Through Christ. And we see as the book of 1 Corinthians as it began, as he was introducing to the brethren in his introduction, the idea of we've got to have the wisdom of God. We've got to have the gospel, because through it Christ is revealed, which is the wisdom of God. So we see that. For whoever finds me finds life. If we find wisdom, Eric made a good point. If we have wisdom, we found God. If we found wisdom, we found God. If we find God, we'll also find what? Wisdom. You can't have one without the other. And obtains favor from the Lord. Favor. Daniel found favor where? In the eyes of the Lord. Right? God blessed him with special knowledge so that he was exalted above his peers. Why? Because he was seeking God. He was seeking wisdom. God blessed him with that. We come to verse 36. But he who sins against me wrongs what? His own soul. Right? We think about the personal nature of this statement. Solomon's telling his son, when you sin, who do you hurt? Will sin hurt those around us? Yeah, it can. But whose soul does it destroy? Mine. Right? I can be hurt by those around me. I can be upset. I can be led astray by those. But ultimately, I'm responsible for my soul. And when I sin, it destroys my soul. we don't find life, right? Life comes through wisdom, we looked at earlier. We see, and those who hate me love what? Do they realize that? But that's what they're drawn to. We've got to seek the wisdom of God. We've got to seek the gospel. Okay. I think it's a good place. We're out of time. Any questions or comments? We'll pick up in chapter 9 next week. And so when we look at this, then I know several are reading ahead. Then I think we're seeing the transition in 9. When you look at the outline that we've handed out, we have 1 through chapters 9 is the first of 3 sections in Proverbs. And we see 9 is going to be a transition period into our next section when we come to verse 10. Any questions or comments? I appreciate your comments and your time.